Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jamie Evans. I'm one of the Associate Medical Directors for On-Demand Care. And tonight I have the pleasure of welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Robert Caudill. He is a professor of psychiatry and the residency training director at the University of Louisville, where he also serves as the director of telemedicine and information technology programs for the Department of Psychiatry. Along with his faculty appointment, Dr. Caudill serves as a staff psychiatrist with several community mental health agencies in Kentucky. Dr.
Mhm.
Caudill was a founding member of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Telepsychiatry, was a previous chair of the Telemental Health Special Interest Group of the American Telepsychiatry Association, and he now serves as a distinguished fellow of both organizations. He lectures on topics related to technology, community psychiatry, and psychopharmacology, and we are happy to have him joining us today as he discusses the future of telepsychiatry now that everyone is a telepsychiatrist. Welcome, Dr. Caudill.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. And thank you, Olivia and Array, for thinking of me and bringing me in. It's a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is sort of where we are and where we're going. All of us now look a bit like a futurist because those of us who are doing telemedicine for years and years, all of a sudden we can see the future, I guess. But we knew it was coming. It was just a matter of when. And it was a surprise, actually, to most of us, think the way it got here. But it has arrived. So about a year ago, which it still sounds like a long, May 11th, actually, this article I had written got published in the Psychiatric News, just titled, "We're All Telepsychiatrists Now." And I think that really kind of summed up my sentiment at the time, and sort of continues to be how I feel, and that it's a radical paradigm shift in the way that we deliver care. You guys knew that beforehand, but I'm not speaking to the converted. As far as disclosures, I'm really speaking for myself. I'm affiliated with a number of organizations, but none of those are particularly relevant to the evening's topic, since I'm talking mostly about future prospects and such. The overview of things I thought I would cover, and some things that had come up that had been I was told might be of interest: the role of measurement-based care or evidence-based care in using the data that we're going to get to drive our clinical decisions in the future, balancing some of these workforce issues, having people work at the top end of their license, how to solve some of the staffing issues that are inevitably going to arise with all the shortages we have, being a training director in a residency training program. I mean, we're training folks as fast as we can, but it still takes 4 years in our psychiatry residency. The funding, has not expanded. The medical schools are growing larger. The competition to get into good residency programs is tighter. But at the end of the day, we're not turning out that many more psychiatrists than we were. On the other hand, a number of other disciplines have really ramped up their efforts, and they're cranking them out quite quickly. And that's going to be an issue for all of us to consider. Taking care of the mental health of our telemental health clinicians. How do we take care of ourselves and our colleagues? That's going to be an issue, because we're facing work environments that we've not seen in the past. I mean, all of us have been doing telepsychiatry, not to belabor that point too much, but the scale is quite different. And when you go from doing it on the side or a few hours here or an afternoon a week, and suddenly that's all you had, well, that's different. I don't know if we're going to go, a lot of people are going to continue to do 100% telemedicine, but some will certainly. And then we need to watch out and make sure that that sort of isolation doesn't create issues for us down the road. Untangling the complexities of the blended hybrid model of care. Patients going forward will have this option that they didn't always have, of being seen in our offices, in our physical offices, versus being seen in their homes, or perhaps even other venues. And so how are we going to figure that all out? House calls are us. You guys have certainly experienced that. That may in the future be the most common site of care for mental health. Hard to say, but we better be ready for that. And then lastly, the issue I think that's kind of a sign of our time is telehealth having some impact on healthcare disparities, healthcare equity, those sorts of topics. Is telemedicine a tool that we can use in there to perhaps reduce some of those disparities? So just to kind of go over measurement-based care, most of you would be familiar with this in one form or another. If nothing else, if you've ever administered a PHQ-9, you know that it's kind of established a role in terms of monitoring patient progress over time in any sort of treatment. 2016 article in Psychiatric Services sort of really put that on the map in psychiatry. It includes really two processes that you have to think of. And this was from a 2019 article in Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. Routine assessments, just measuring, measurements change things. When you start measuring things, you get different outcomes just by simply measuring them. Heisenberg's principle or something, but if you check the pressure in your tire, you lower the pressure in the tire by checking it. There inevitably are interventions and our measurements tied together. So that's part of it. And then using this data to make decisions. I know that some of you might be involved with the National Network of Depression Centers. Jay Shore and I co-direct the telehealth portion of that. And one of their big initiatives has been to sort of make more routine the use of PHQ-9s in assessing depression over time. And they built in add-on modules that fit into electronic medical records such as Epic to trend that data over time, so you can kind of see how that's going. So I think that's only going to become more common. The instruments themselves may be the weak link in the chain at the moment, but they will get better. Not all of these, screening instruments may or may not be a good tracking instrument. So some thought needs to be given to that as well. But no question that incorporation of regularly gathered data will increasingly play a role in what we do, if for no other reason, third-party payers will want to see that sort of thing. How will you justify the frequency and intensity of treatment recommendations if you don't have some sort of relatively good data to back that up? The downside to all of this is someone has to collect the measurements, and that's inevitably a bit of a tedious process. The PHQ-9 has been successful because it's 9 questions, and most people will put up with that. If you get into anything much more involved, there's pushback on the patient end, there's pushback on the clinician end to review it, there's pushback on the staff end to administer these things. Technology can only solve that to a certain degree. In our actual in-person clinic at the university, we have a number of iPads that are available and preloaded with the PHQ-9, and that data automatically uploads going into Epic, which is a nice feature, but that took a ton of back-end engineering to make that viable. And who knows where it will lead to. It's collecting a lot of data that we will find useful, I think, down the road. Using standard, this is sort of a summary of what we've just covered, using standardized instruments to measure symptom function over time. And then we use that information to target areas. It helps us recognize when we're getting improvement. A lot of times patients themselves, aren't the best independent appraiser of where their clinical status is. But when you can show them on your computer monitor or whatever you're collecting that their trend is actually improving, again, the changes that occur in an individual patient, because they don't see interval change, because they're there every minute. It's like when you go away and come back and your grass needs to be mowed, something happened. But if you're there looking at it every single day, the grass doesn't seem to grow very much. And patients have that same experience. So I think that's one of the other things that these episodic interval measurements can prove useful for us. I think it also creates a basis for collaborative work. So those of our colleagues who in primary care or other fields of medicine, when they have nice trigger points to say, okay, well, anything that's in double digits, I'm going to refer, or everything above a 15, I'm going to refer. It gives them some sort of, landmarks there to base that on. It also gives them a quick, way to communicate with us what we're dealing with when we're on the receiving end. There was an article in Psychiatric News Roy Rainey wrote, some of you would be familiar with her work, just talking about measurement-based care is at the heart of collaborative care model, which is another thing we'll talk about in a bit. And it advances the ability of clinicians to provide robust treatments for patients. Measurement-based care, absolutely necessary to report outcomes to payers in this changing healthcare environment where value-based purchasing is the wave of the future. I think, at the end of the day, you've got to tie it back to getting paid some way, or you're not in business very long. So I think this is all a worthy topic to kind of keep in focus. The other thing I like this about data is we're going to have new sources of data we haven't even considered. We always think about the technologies providing access, and access is huge, and I'll come back to that word many times. But the other thing that we're going to get out of these devices that we didn't have in an in-person setting is all kinds of other data that's just being mined. Things like facial expression can be determined off of reading key focal points on the face of a patient, just like we use facial recognition software to tell who you've got. Right now we have these concerns about, when we're beaming into the house of a patient that we've never seen before, how sure are we that we really have who we have? I mean, who checks IDs? Who asks, and what sort of IDs can be easily faked and shown over a camera? So facial recognition may be one way to get around just basic things like identification, but also we're going to find that certain facial patterns probably correlate to certain clinical conditions. We know that a skilled clinician develops all sort of intuitive tips. I mean, if you've ever rounded with residents who are very green to this, you can walk into the room and know things instantly before the patient starts talking that the resident doesn't get until, hopefully by the end of 4 years, they start picking up on some of these nonverbal, unspoken things, just tone of voice stuff. And I think what's going to happen as we start collecting this data in a very formal way and turning all of this into ones and zeros is that we're going to see big patterns, big data. It's going to give us insights that, again, seasoned clinicians already have, but we can maybe short circuit that a bit in our trainees and showing them that this voice recognition pattern, you don't have to know this, but the algorithm itself will detect it. And it'll say, there's a 70% likelihood of depression in a patient with this vocalization pattern, or this is a manic episode that's coming on based on what it's seeing. And it's not a clinician, it's just looking at numbers. But again, when you have the processor speed to do that, the data that we're going to be collecting that we previously couldn't get from simple in-person visits is going to be a tool for us. So I think watch out for that. Working at the top of the license, how do we incorporate, what some refer to as mid-levels, other mental health clinicians? How do we make them part of the team when the team is all virtual? One of the things I've done when I've worked on inpatient or in-person clinics rather, was to establish the idea that we're going to use a biopsychosocial model, but we're going to do it in that order. And that puts us as physicians typically at the bottleneck spot. And if we decide we're going to do it all ourselves, we're not going to get to very many patients that day sometimes. So being able to triage that, being able to sort of assign that and to relegate that, define it, pass it to other folks who can do the same work. Maybe it's going to take a few extra sessions that way, but there's just not enough of us to go around. So we're going to be working in teams whether we want to or not. So I always go in, I found that when I beam primarily into rural sites, and there's a great shortage for skilled psychopharmacology out there. A lot of just rat's nest kind of complicated psychopharm regimens that probably shouldn't exist and have to be teased apart and cleaned up. And that's where the crisis is kind of occurring for me. So I walk in and make sure I do that. They typically have decent nurses, they have decent social workers, and they just can't get physicians to come locate out into these rural areas. So keeping that in mind has helped me. So using these virtual social workers, nurse practitioners, others to supplement us will help us make the best use of everyone's time. The devil is always in the details. Just how does that get broken down? I've worked a lot with nurse practitioners over the years, and I've seen their idea of what their mission change over time as well. So 20 years ago, I guess, when they were relatively new in my state, they mostly got relegated to very basic, straightforward cases, not a lot of complicated polypharmacy going on. We cleaned that up, and then we gave them the patients that were sort of in a maintenance phase. That's not what's happening out there these days. I think it's a nurse practitioner caseload and the psychiatrist caseload more and more becoming indistinguishable. I'm not arguing that that's a good thing. I don't think it is, but I do think we're going to see mission creep and turf wars and guild issues still get played out. All of our professional organizations are onto this and fighting it out. But I don't know where this settles. It's not going to be made any easier by the uncertainties around licensure and how that's all played out and been manifest through the COVID situation. But be aware of it if you aren't already. I think you are. Workforce issues. What are the implications here? There's just not enough of us. As I mentioned, we're training as fast as we can, and telemedicine to the rescue. And one of the things I got in trouble with in this age of political correctness, I guess, is I mentioned to the fact that, I'll take a chance here. Psychiatry has been one of the more friendly specialties to having women and men in there. Women are well represented in psychiatry. This isn't news to anybody. They've always been and always should be. My university president is female. My dean of my medical school is female. Nothing new about that. But sometimes when families come onto the scene, somebody stays home with the kids. And statistically, and not my opinion, statistically, it's more often the woman than the man. And so we're losing workforce when there's no other option to continue to practice if you have to stay home with the kids. Now I stay home. I've been home on days with my kids because I can work from home. So that's not an issue around my house, but it has been for some. And telemedicine has been one way to recapture some of that time. And when people have completed an elaborate training program and they're wanting to work, I mean, my female residents in my class who started families during their course of their residency were very thankful that my program was one of the early adopters for telemedicine, because they walked out of their training into telemedicine kinds of careers and have been able to remain home with their children. I think that's wonderful. So hopefully that's not too much of an issue. It solves it on both for anybody, but something to think about as we try to get more staffing out there. Taking care of ourselves. This is another piece of the puzzle, because we're losing folks on the back end. If we burn people out, if we put them into situations where they just don't want to do this anymore, If we don't take care of ourselves and our colleagues, then the boat's leaking. So thinking about ways to create networks of peers, informal connection points, so this isolation that can occur when you're working in your basement in a windowless office all day doesn't become overwhelming. Create a group, a cadre of professionals that specialize in mental health for mental health professionals, so they can also get the help they need through telehealth. One of the big barriers, I think, to this has historically been anonymity. I mean, working with colleagues who know if they do identify themselves as needing help, they're basically going to have to check that box on every hospital privilege form for the rest of their life, and then fill out the back page explaining what happened. That we've come up with some creative proposals, and none of this is actually in place, but how do we get help to clinicians who are very reticent about disclosing that they're struggling? Do we have to wait until something breaks to get in there? One thought was the creation of sort of a sim world, and this might be a role for avatars, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But if someone who was sort of feeling the early signs of burnout and needing some help, but didn't feel like they could go through traditional avenues, what if they just showed up in a sim world, 3D simulation world where they were cloaked and the clinician was cloaked? So I don't know who the real identity of the patient doesn't know my real identity. All they know is that I've volunteered to help out a wounded healer, and they're coming there for that help. Would that lower the bar? One of the first things I would probably do is try to steer them to the more legitimate, passages that we have in place, because there's certain things I wouldn't be able to do in that environment, without a doubt. I mean, I'm not going to be able to prescribe, for instance, in all likelihood. But could I counsel somebody in a way that guaranteed this privacy? I think we'd pull a few people out of the fire every year if that sort of service were available, that we're probably losing right now. And it's like what happened with COVID. Everybody heard about the folks who died these horrible deaths in the ICUs, but that's not our patients in mental health and psychiatry. Our patients died quietly at home and got found, when nobody came out for the mail. So I think we've kind of, that's the problem with our field of some degree, is we lose a lot of our folks very quietly. They're lost in the shuffle. And this might be a way to get back at that. I don't know. Zoom fatigue, I hope I'm okay using a trademark term, but whatever you want to call it, sitting and staring at a monitor all day is hard. And it's hard in a different way. There's a certain sort of pressure we all put on ourselves once some portion of our brain recognizes that we're on camera. That in and of itself is just enough to turn up the cortisol a little bit, I think, for some people, and make it feel more stressful. My colleagues who were brand new to this, who kind of got thrown into telepsychiatry after not having any interest in it until they had no other choice, they all said, 8 hours of this is harder than 8 hours of what I was doing in person. So I think we've got a lot of informal indications that we need to watch out for that. Burnout prevention, resiliency training. I'm required to do a presentation every year to the incoming resident group on burnout prevention and resiliency training. I don't know how much good it does, but at least training programs are recognizing that we need to make some sort of commitment to this. And 6 a.m. Mandatory yoga isn't going to get it done. So we've got to look at other options. I talked about the role for avatars in there. I mean, at the end of a lot of weeks, I don't know if anybody else relates to this. This is my feeling about where I am some weeks. And I've got to go find a way to recharge that. For me, tennis, music, family, those kind of things. And I have to recognize that they don't necessarily come find me. I've got to go play tennis. If tennis won't come to me, I've got to go find some music. The kind of music I want to hear and be improved by won't necessarily find me. The other one, is just something like this. You may have seen these sort of memes. So another thing I think that helps keep us in the game, though, is recognizing the sense of purpose. And some of you may have seen this before, but I like to use this with my residents quite a bit, that if you can find that you actually are living in that center square there, the Ikigai center, where you've combined what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for, that can keep you in the game a long time. And if you're drifting outside of that, you'll find, where what you need to do maybe to right the ship. But hopefully, we're all here because that's where we belong. And we just need a little bit of recharge from time to time to get back to that. So next will be the challenges going forward, because this is going to be the new standard of care. The complexities of this blended, or it's most often called the hybrid model of care. And that's just the acknowledgement that patients going forward now have a choice. As of July 1 of last year, the hybrid model became our official model in our teaching clinic. So pretty much all of the legislation and regulations that we needed to make that the standard finally fell away. And most of us thought this was way overdue. And there were places like, I think Kaiser was doing that. I think some of the VA sites had this up and running for quite a while. But this idea that when you meet with the patient on the first visit and you're concluding the visit and doing the wrap up, then you make a decision on, well, what would you like to do next time? Do you want to come back to the office or meet in person or some mixed combination of that? So I don't think there's any going back on that. Once patients have had a taste of being seen in their homes, they're going to demand it. And if you can't provide that, they'll go somewhere else where they can find it, because I think there'll be plenty of providers too. So this is the new normal. What are we going to do about transitioning out of this co-video teleconferencing 19 environment back to the new normal? I get 7 cents in royalties every time I use that phrase, I think. Anyway, the transition stage in between, what about the patients that we've met and we've only seen them on video? We've never actually seen them in person, and they want to come in our office and be seen. Right now, I think most of us, at least until here just very recently, in Kentucky, we're still a lockdown state. Basically, the governor here won't release it fully until like June 10 or June 11. So when I'm sitting in a room with my resident, a medical student, the patient, and myself, and we're all wearing masks and we're trying to communicate, you lose a lot of data when you can't see somebody's face from their eyes to their chin. And so I would rather anytime interview a patient over video right now than in person. Hopefully we'll get that balance back the way it ought to be, but we're losing more data. I think people always said, don't you lose a lot of data on video? I'm saying if you only can see half of a face, I'm losing a lot of data there too. Nobody seems to be bothered by that. But anyway, patients have been waiting for this though. They've been demanding. Every time patients have been given an opportunity to choose this option, they choose it. It's really, some of our clinicians, now you guys are with Array and you're familiar with the telepsychiatry and telemedicine field, so you're not the ones that have been the problematic, but if you probably got some stick in the mud colleagues who didn't understand what you were doing or why you were doing it or why you thought it would be a great way to do this. So it's our fellow clinicians who have been the challenge at times. When COVID hit at my university, we had a nice boutique up and running program in psychiatry, and we were seeing hundreds of patients a week, but almost no other program at the university really was. We were an outlier in that, and so they realized they had a bit of that we could scale out. All we did was scale out the models we already had in place, and we transitioned really quickly. But internal medicine, as a department at my university, on the first few days of no in-person care, they canceled like 1,600 appointments and did not reschedule them. Now, you don't have to be an accountant to figure out the 1,600 appointments that were on your books that just disappeared overnight. It's going to hit the bottom line sooner or later. So they got motivated to get me over there, and I had to deal with folks. And it was a much easier sale than I had in the past, because it basically was going to people and say, would you like to see patients tomorrow or not? And so when you put people up against the wall, they sometimes somehow get a little more flexible, I suppose. Anyway, what role will telephones play too? That's another question that we're going to have to figure out in this new hybrid world. Most of us were caught a little bit by surprise, I think, by how important the telephone turned out to be in all of this. We didn't really torture test all these bandwidth issues. We tended to go into rural areas that had decent bandwidth by definition, because those rural areas that didn't have the good bandwidth couldn't even start to contract with us. So, but they all had telephones. And I think, this just rights a historic wrong. I mean, medicine took a huge wrong turn over 100 years ago. I mean, the telephone's been around 150 years or something. I mean, telephone's been around a long time, but we accepted the idea that we didn't get paid for talking on telephones. Lawyers and accountants and financial advisors didn't make that mistake, but somehow physicians, our time is free all of a sudden if we're on a telephone, unless we could see you too. And so I think that's kind of getting corrected. I think we should be getting paid for our cognitive services delivered over telephone, and maybe we're there. There are other means though, and there may be some advantages, and certainly email security is an issue. HIPAA is uncertain right now. Texting, also similar thing. There are some secure platforms for that. I would encourage their use. And chats are going to be another thing that have some real opportunity, not only because they are asynchronous potentially, but also because they tie into AI in a way when we do talk about chat bots. So I want to make sure I mention that. Hybrid practice, this is sort of, picture Peter Yellow leaves his office. So most of us aren't going to get to see that office any other way. So I like to share it. But so Peter's got his 3 monitors up there, but the only difference between in-person and tele is which way he pivots his office chair. He can see back-to-back patients, one on video, the next one in person. That is the new model for most established clinicians. Now, I think the newer model will be folks that are working out of their home and never, pay $1 in office rental. And they can do that by aligning themselves with organizations like Array and others, perhaps, that allow for that. So that's certainly a model. But I want to also talk about the hybrid practice, because I don't think the in-person care piece is going to go away entirely. I kind of hope it doesn't. I think it's, telemedicine has always been an additional tool for us, but it wasn't meant to replace in-person care entirely. It was just an additional thing. Unlike teleradiology, for instance, I don't think telepsychiatry falls away as a term necessarily the way teleradiology did. There is no teleradiology per se that's different than radiology, because it's all done potentially digitally and over distance. So one thing, sorry about the black, I forgot to change the color there. Hopefully you can read this, but let me talk about just a concept here of etiquette and how that's evolving and how technology, co-evolves with us. So there's really 3 scenarios I'd want you to consider here. One is the one that has been around for millennia. I mean, this is since, one caveman went over to another caveman's dwelling for a barbecue or something. You're going into somebody else's space, and there's another life form in that space, and you know how to do this. We all learned at an early age. So we have introductions. We may, in olden days, shake hands. Now we fist bump or elbow bump, or I don't know what we do. But there's some sort of, you might be offered a beverage. You might be offered an opportunity to take a seat. All of those things can occur. And so this is very well known. Contrast that with another thing that's also well known, but a little bit more recent. That's walking into a room with a machine present, some sort of technology in there. There's no life force in there except for the patient or you or whoever's walking in there. And this is like a vending machine room. If you've got a vending machine room at your office, or you're familiar with that, you walk in there, there's a machine, you're going to have an encounter, because you're going to have an exchange. You're going to give the vending machine money. It's going to give you product, wham, bam, and you're out of there. Not a lot of chit chat, not a lot of socializing, but you know how to interact with machinery when it's in a room. I propose that the telemedicine encounter is somewhere in between, and that patients walking in and they do sense that there's no physical biological aura in the room, but they know that they're going to have an encounter. My patients get straight to work with me when they walk in. They don't feel a need for the chit chat a lot of times. They want to jump right in for why they came. My visits are oftentimes shorter than they would be in person, because we kind of eliminated a lot of the little fluff. I miss some of that, but I also recognize, in a certain way, this is kind of more efficient. So we can jump right to it. So this idea of walking into a room, whether it's an artificial intelligence, whether it's a bot, whether it's an avatar on the screen, or whether it's you or me on the screen, that's an in-between sort of third way. Oh, there we go. That's what happened. Sorry, my animation's got ahead of me, so there you can see that. Hybrid care, different ways to look at that. There are advantages for those with avoidant behaviors, PTSD, and anxiety. People used to say, well, is telemedicine as good as in person? And I'd say the answer to that is like the answer to almost every question you get asked these days. And the answer, of course, is it depends. It depends. It's better for many patients. It's not as good for some. It's part of our job to figure that out. Clinician can observe the patient in their own environment. That's a huge advantage. There's indirect and off-hour care that's much more easily delivered. Modalities, video conferencing, mail, texting, all these other things are possible when you have technology. Of course, because it's been around forever, the in-person is the gold standard. And there may be some intimacy, trust issues, but there's a lot of patients that just can't make it in the first place because of their avoidant behavior. So that's the problem. And then there's ample research and stuff on that that's been accumulated over many years. Hybrid relationship managed across a variety of settings. You will need to be clear in terms of educating the patient regarding the boundaries of this, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Patients it's new to them too, so they're pushing the boundaries all over the place with this. But you do need to pay attention to rapport, the trust, the comfort of each patient with the technology and the communication. Check in from time to time with the patient on how they're feeling about it. Clarifying miscommunications, misunderstandings, which can occur, certainly. And if you're going to use emojis in any kind of texting thing, make sure you know which ones you're using, because that can get problematic. Green screens, controlling the environment. Most of us are getting more comfortable with this. I've seen some really bad green screens though, or not. Well, if you have a green screen, it's probably not going to be really bad, but really bad virtual backgrounds. So if you want to have a good virtual background, you probably need to invest. This is a typical TV studio that allows for that backdrop, and you can see how they go I'm in front of a green screen right now. I don't know how obvious that is to you, but this is my actual office at work, but I'm in my basement at home. A good green screen. The other thing is, when you pop up a hand, a good green screen gives you, I have all 5 fingers non-amputated, but if you have a sort of mixed background, it'll start amputating fingers and it'll be fuzzy out there, and just don't do that. Get a green screen. They're not that expensive. So, back to making house calls. I always like to say this is a 1946 ad. You know what it's for? It's for Camel cigarettes, of course, because we used to hawk those things, I guess, back then. But at any rate, the whole concept of house calls, I mean, most of us did not grow up in an era where house calls were prevalent, but yet we're kind of heading back there where we are making house calls again. This is sort of one thing is, I think you guys have something called at-home service line that's kind of going to be a player on that. Reaching the previously unreachable patients. There are urban and rural issues. I mean, we like to think that urban areas can't be underserved, but they certainly can be. And sometimes it's related to their access to the necessary technology. More in the rural area, it can be that as well, but it's also, you've got bandwidth issues that can creep into that. A lot of times the bandwidth I have found when I've been working with these community mental health centers, it's pretty good to the county seat. But if I want to start seeing these patients in their home on their iPad or their laptop or something, can't do that because the band, they don't have it out to that point. So there is that. I think we have to reset these boundaries over time. So I mean, who has met with a patient that was in a vehicle that was rolling? I have, just long enough to tell them to pull over to the side of the road and if they want to continue. So, but park cars turn out to be pretty good. Actually, park cars are kind of a partial solution to the privacy issue. I've got folks in chaotic home situations who just go out to the car, close the door, and they've got like a therapy, capsule ready to go. As long as they're not driving, that works for me. Who's in the audience? Who else is in the house? Who's just off screen? All of those things we want to make sure we're aware of. Public and private HIPAA relevance. Patients want to do these things in Starbucks with headsets in. Say, well, I'm private. Well, I'm not sure if that's private or not. So we'll have to solve all that. The answers are not clear. We get new information and new opportunities. Peter Shore, some distant relationship to Jay Shore, I believe, but Peter's a psychologist up in the Northwest, did some of the earliest work on in-home direct-to-consumer work through the VA. He talked about a patient who was really shut down, a rural vet. They provided this veteran with the bandwidth and the laptop, but wasn't getting anywhere with him. But he was seeing him in his home, and he noticed in the background of the shot were some Chicago Cubs memorabilia hanging. And Peter knew just about enough about the Chicago Cubs to start commenting on that, and the guy just opened up. And that was like the key. And that would never have occurred in person, right? Because you'd never know that was a thing. So there's opportunity here in these in-home visits that we've never really had before. I think, we've had their discussion about maybe this is a new element for the mental status exam. What background, what room did the patient choose? This is their choice. Why did they choose the car and not the dining room? Why did they choose the dining room and not the bedroom? Why did they choose the bedroom and not the bathroom? I don't know. But those are questions we should be asking because they control that piece of it. And so maybe we need to think about how that incorporates into our assessments going forward. Can telehealth meaningfully impact the health equity, the digital divide? The telephone is suddenly relevant. Most of us didn't see that come. I think it comes down to money, like many of these things. At the end of the day, the cheapest solutions ultimately seem to prevail. So I missed the bet. I was predicting that we'd have 3D life-size holograms. That's what I wanted. And what we got was the iPhone. Kind of worked, but I mean, I didn't want to be, my early work was on something called the representational silhouette. That was the idea that we worked best if the retinal image of the patient that we were working with and our image on their retina was similar to what it would be if we were the same distance in person. And that might be a relevant point in terms of, it's turned out it's probably not relevant because most of us are seeing patients they're seeing us on an iPhone. A lot of my patients, the endpoint, that's the minimum, cost of admission these days. So there is that. Medication is probably used more than therapy because it's cheaper to produce 30 days worth of medication than it is to train a therapist, all things being equal. Why are medications freely prescribed? That's the same reason. So is there an opening here for disruptive technologies? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that as we wrap up. What is a disruptive technology in this area? Bots certainly have a role to play there, I think, and asynchrony, if you're wanting to look at things that might drive the future. This was why I grew up thinking 3D hologram images might be a thing. And I wanted life size. I wanted them full size. I didn't want this little miniature Princess Leia. And but really the only big place, I mean, this is a real technology that exists. If you haven't seen these sort of clips or seen this demonstration in person, you should. Tupac has been resurrected in 3D. Otherwise, we've not really made great use of this technology, but it's out there. And the devices to do it are expensive. So your typical rural community mental health center is not likely to do that. So you're not going to get 3D imaging. Like I say, the iPad is what we got, but can't complain. I like my iPhone as well. Steve Jobs did something amazing. Some of you heard me say this, maybe, I don't know, I say this a lot, but what I'm most impressed with about Steve Jobs, because he wasn't a great human being in lots of ways, but he did one thing that's kind of amazing, and that is he sold telephones to deaf people. So I think for the first time in history, deaf folks were buying telephones when he incorporated FaceTime and the forward-facing camera. So as far as the future, you know, what are we looking forward to? Access has been the key word up until now. It's all been about access, and that's not a bad thing, but I think we need to start looking at disruption and to get there. And what I've said, you know, the pioneers and the settlers are two different groups of people. And the pioneers have kind of come through and plowed the ground for telemedicine, synchronous, simultaneous video teleconferencing. It's a mature technology. It's not something that needs a lot of pioneering in these days. There are some things though that we can look at doing. And so what we've currently done is we basically use some of these tools like video teleconferencing to deliver the same sort of quality care, but just doing it at a distance. It still takes, you know, 15 minutes or whatever to do a stable med check. It still takes 50 minutes or more to do a new patient evaluation. So I don't get any time leverage. I'm just able to do it at distance, which is going to be different than what we're looking at the next step. And these will be disruptive technologies, things where we have the therapeutic use of apps. You know, an app, once well written, if it can impact a patient's care, it can do it 1,000 times, you know, at the same time. 1,000 patients can benefit from one app at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. Whereas I don't have that kind of magnification or scale. So this is where we're really going to see some things play out. Asynchronous telepsychiatry, you know, deserves a couple hours on its own, but I think that's going to, once we find a way to monetize that properly, that's going to be a real tool. Population-based collaborative care models, that's a different topic entirely, but it is something that overlaps here a bit. Voice assistance, machine translation, the role of translators in care, that's got to be looked at. AI in mental health care, primarily through chatbots. We've gotten a couple papers we've written on this. But I mean, all of you are probably aware when you go onto a website and a little thing pops up and says, "Hi, I'm Jim. Can I help you?" Jim isn't really a thing. Jim is just like 20 questions away if you're lucky, and it's probably not Jim. It's probably Pakur, and he's probably on another continent. But the idea of the artificial intelligence infusing these bots to where you can, you know, pass the Turing test for 20 questions or so is very interesting. Augmented and virtual reality have a role. And then lastly, one of my favorite topics we won't have much time to get into because it's still on the horizon is avatars and the use of avatars and avatars as a concept and a theory and a way to see through all of this. I'll just flip through this. This is just a real quick slide showing you technologies that we're all using pretty much every day, take for granted. The emergent technologies are the ones that are coming. They're the next thing sort of in the pipeline. This is the paper Peter wrote several years ago on asynchronous telepsychiatry. It's practically mature. We don't need any new technology for this. All we need is relaxation of certain regulations. This is Peter. He's got the video of a patient that was filmed, you know, hours ago. He's typing up a report and looking at his notes, you know, at the same time. That should be a thing. You know, when we have no shows, we fill them up with some of these within, you know, get the answer back in a week. It does have a useful role. The collaborative care model, if you want to see more about that, the APA has done a lot of educating on that. Language barriers, you know, my clinic, we use translators every single day. We have translator phones in place. They're not really the best. I mean, I've been fortunate. I have, you know, multilingual residents from time to time. I tell them what you need to do is go into telemedicine, touting the fact that you don't need a translator for this particular population, because there's a saying that says lost in translation. That means something. We do lose something in translation. So these language barriers are real. Most of the real common translators, unfortunately, aren't HIPAA secure. So that's why this hasn't really taken off. But a lot of, you know, with these heads-up display and smart glass, that's been attempted and used. And this is an example of that Google Glass. Unfortunately, again, getting HIPAA secure translation software, that's going to be tough. It's very expensive to develop good translation software. Who wants to jump through all the additional hoops to get it HIPAA, you know, secure? I don't know when that happens. Some of the therapeutic apps, there's a variety of these. You're probably familiar with them. SAM is one. There's the T2 group out of the military has done a lot of good stuff. Breathe to Relax. Probably most of you are using that, familiar with that. The chatbot stuff, you know, as I mentioned, I think has real potential because of the scale of the thing. And this is from Wired magazine, but it's also showed up in the Wall Street Journal. So this is no longer secret. If you just wanted to play with Woebot, W-O-E-B-O-T, I have no commercial relations to any of these things, but it's worth playing with. It's got some CBT kind of underpinnings to it. I don't know if it's ready for prime time, but when I get patients, particularly those that are tech savvy and are asking me, is there anything else I can do? I say, play with this. It's not part of my official treatment recommendation, but since you ask, so things to think about there. They've got some of these animatronic like artificial intelligence infused things might be the next step. This one's a little clumsy, but it's getting a lot of coverage. This is a robot they developed. Let's see if I got a clip on this that we can see.
And her voice comes out of these speakers here. And I can show you what she sees. So that's wow. So she's looking at you and she's trying to recognize your face. All right, you're on. And you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I guess. Hi, Dina. I'm Grace. I'm a reporter from BT Bigger.
Well, hi. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
We're using a form of artificial general intelligence to help 48 field inquiries, questions that come up in social conversation.
So that's kind of a combination of robotics along with the chatbot feature. And I don't know what the role for that is. That seems a little harder. I mean, we may be able to just do the whole thing from a purely CGI background. We could generate the whole thing on a computer, and that might be an easier way to go than to actually build these physical models that have this sort of Disney World-like feature to it. Some of you have heard of deep fakes, and this is where it sort of takes the physical manifestation of one face and maps that onto another. This is going to be a real interesting avenue for avatars. So. So that's something that's got some potential. And then, Disney has obviously used this in many animations. This is the actual actor or actress, and then her facial characteristics get played out on this. I won't show that to you. You can find this stuff on YouTube easy enough yourself. But this is, some of you have this in your purse, or you're in your belt, or on your pocket. This looks a little familiar, a little bit scary here, but let me see if this will play. This technology has already trickled down to the level of the mobile phone. It sometimes seems more like a toy than a tool, but it has gotten surprisingly good. It picks up some subtleties. Premises. Worth a try. So that's me playing with my phone, in case you did figure that out. But there's also other things you can do if you're playing with your phone. And for those occasions when you just have to be a rainbow unicorn, well, they've thought of that too. So that kind of opens the idea for avatars down the road. And we do a lot of work on cultural issues and cross-cultural psychiatry, but theoretically, and this is the scary, brave new world, I mean, you can be whoever you want to be. So if I need to be, a 78-year-old Asian female, I could potentially be one. And who's to stop me? And I don't know, but the technology won't be the thing. And so be on the lookout for avatars. And at that point, I'm going to stop, that's how you reach me. It's easy. It's my name at louisville.edu. And there we go. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Want to open the floor now for any questions or any discussion here.
So I have a question. Thank you for that presentation. I really enjoyed it and raised some super interesting issues when you were talking about the avatars and virtual backgrounds. What I was imagining was ways that patients might be able to build in layers of deception to hide, things like genuine affect, or basically have a layer of modification between their presentation, their genuine affect, tone of voice, and what we're perceiving. And I guess I'm hoping that whatever platforms we're using for the teleconferencing help, can reduce the likelihood that what we're seeing and basing our clinical judgments on will have been, substantially modified by the patient to try to, deceive us in some way potentially. And I'm just wondering if I hadn't really thought of that until now. I guess I can see how, we can change how we look to them potentially in a way, to increase the therapeutic potential. But what if it works the other way somehow?
No, that's a great point. I think, I've given this a lot of thought because this is my most exciting area, I think, but ethically, we can't just jump into it. So we're gonna have to wait until some things kind of catch up. But, to a certain degree, modification of avatar at the end of the patient may unintentionally reveal things rather than hide them. I mean, we are all at this point a two-dimensional representation of each other on our respective monitors. So none of us are a 3D thing in the presence of each other. And so we have the opportunity, and we all do this knowingly or not, we modify our avatars. I mean, if my two-dimensional image on my screen now looks very different than it did 15 years ago. I know folks, that are unrecognizable because of the style of the hair, the facial hair, the style of glasses. I mean, we can do a lot of things to modify our avatar right now. And I just accept that when I'm beaming into a patient's home and what they get of me is a two-dimensional flat display, I'm an avatar whether I want to admit it or not. And I've modified it to a certain degree. I mean, I'm wearing professional clothing. Sometimes I'll throw a tie on when I wouldn't in any other setting. But I can think about that. Now, think about when the potential there's unlimited. So I'm talking to a patient and they roll up and they're a dragon or they're a dinosaur or they're Barney. I mean, they've told me something. I mean, that they're giving me a lot of information I didn't have now. I know who they want me to think of them as. And so we'll have to sort of balance it. I don't think it'd be good to do therapy with an avatar where it's nothing but an avatar. Occasionally it'd be nice to see their actual representation, but it'd also be kind of cool to see them as an avatar. Who do you want me to see you as? So those kind of questions are all out there, and I think are potentially fascinating. I got the idea actually following a child psychiatry consult team around and watching them work with kids who were shut down on cancer wards, and they would often pull out the puppets. And the kid who wouldn't talk to any of these, intimidating adults standing around the bed would talk to the Barney puppet. And I realized Barney's an avatar. And so this isn't new. This is as old as sock puppets. But we can make it whatever we want. And I think the technology allowed us to go some really interesting places potentially.
Yeah, it raises some interesting issues in terms of consent, particularly with patients who may not be quite as familiar. Most of the patients I'm treating from my basement are older patients with Medicare, and for many of them, a lot of the technology is new for them. And I'm wondering if there would need to be certain discussions or, maybe a particular consenting process if there are some kinds of filters in place. But I do like your idea of how that, that may actually add something additional to the clinical interaction if there are, avatars, things like that.
Let me break it down even one more way. We're talking about visual avatars, but I could have things that change my voice characteristics. So, and if I don't change my voice and all I do is change my visual representation, how is that much difference than me talking to them on a telephone? Because all the audio piece is unaltered. But if I alter the video piece to reflect some other, I appear as Sigmund Freud, let's say, how does that change it? What does it change it in what way? Does it make it worse, better? I don't know, but those are questions we'll be asking and maybe one day answer. The whole area of avatars, I mean, I start with my residents when I'm supervising their psychotherapy. I just sort of say, accept the fact that you're an avatar right now. And I've got residents that, have shoulder length, men with shoulder length hair. I've got a few that have visible tattoos. I say, you've chosen to alter this is the avatar you're presenting with. And that's going to work for you in certain settings. I mean, you've probably enhanced your collaborative opportunities, but you've also maybe limited in some other areas. So think about that. So regardless of what I might think is the truest representation of my soul, that's not what's for sale when I'm in the clinic. I'm trying to be the everyman. I'm trying to be as neutral and as available, because I don't know who's coming through the door, and I don't want to put anybody off. I want everybody to see me as accessible. So I'm going to try to come in with nothing that would put anybody off, and we'll kind of build from there. But if you know that you're dealing with a population of nothing but motorcycle gang members, maybe beaming in there looking like one wouldn't hurt you.
Other questions?
Comments, weird thoughts?
Ideas sparked?
My thought is that any technology that's out there gets used. So people say, well, this avatar stuff, we shouldn't do anything like that. It will never do that. No, I'm afraid that's going to happen. Will we do it responsibly? Will we do it thoughtfully? Will we do it in a way that's respectful? That's the part we get to decide on. But whether it's going to happen or not, well, it's happening now. I mean, you guys for very little money can get the software you need to present yourself as virtually anybody you want to. Deep fakes are not that hard to pull off. I mean, that's why, there's lots of reasons there's not much trust in the media, but one of them is because deep fakes are so easy.
Has anyone used any of these technologies in clinical care at all?
Very, very little, and the consenting process is extensive, as you might expect. I mean, there are legitimate ethical issues around it, and I would never recommend anybody misrepresent. So I think you have to almost go in. I mean, the opportunity too. If you have 2 or 3 photographs, you can basically turn that into a 3D computer generated image, and then you can populate that newly created avatar. So think about this. Here's a terrifying thought for you. You're working with a trauma patient, and you could come in and be their dad. You can be their mom. You can be their perpetrator. You could be somebody in their story. If they bring in a few photographs, all of a sudden they're not just role playing. They're role playing with somebody that looks and looks at least like the person involved. I don't know what the opportunities are. I don't know what the threats are with that. I haven't really gotten that far along. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just telling you that once these technologies roll out, people start thinking about, well, how can I use this? And somebody will. So maybe some thoughtful people ought to be involved in that discussion as well.
Well, this has been very thought-provoking, I know, and appreciate your time. We can leave it there if so that we're respectful of everybody's top of the hour here. But thank you everybody for joining, and thank you very much, Dr. Caudill, for leading us through that really interesting stuff.
Glad to do it anytime. Hope to see you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.